Hello, this is again Dr. Jonathan Bentovish. I'm with God's Physics. This book has been published by iUniverse.com and it's been published all over the world and being translated in different countries. There's been also 60 plus peer-reviewed articles, scientific peer-reviewed articles that came out, and two special issues now, a third special issue coming out dedicated entirely to this new scientific paradigm for the 21st century. And today's talk is very special. This is the first day of Hanukkah for the Jewish people, which is a holy time and a very special time. And I want to record a presentation whose topic is God's Physics, New 21st Century Scientific Paradigm, the Courage to Discover Truth. And so perhaps the first point that I want to highlight, one of my great heroes, not just myself obviously, but one of my great heroes is Albert Einstein, and especially, by the way, for his courage to pursue truth and discover truth in a very courageous and open-minded manner. When Einstein was asked about 100 years ago, what would he think, or what does he think would be the fate of relativity theory in 100 years? Would it stand true forever? And this great scientist, great humble scientist, and had quite a foresight. He said, "No, I do not think that relativity theory would hold true forever, because science evolves. I just hope that relativity theory would become a special case within a broader understanding." And that's precisely what's happening today. We spoke about it, but science is now in a transition from the old paradigm, material causal paradigm of relativity theory and quantum mechanics, to the new God's physics paradigm, which is acausal computation. And this new God's physics paradigm essentially is based on the discovery of a singular higher ordered universal computational / consciousness principle, which simultaneously computes the whole universe as a series of frames many billions of times per second. And this new God's physics paradigm is revolutionizing science. But because the topic of today's presentation is God's physics new scientific paradigm, the courage to discover truth, that's also related. Maybe I'll say a word about this later on. It's also very much related to this special day, this special holiday for the Jewish people. Hanukkah is a celebration of a little light dispersing the darkness. That's what happened for the Jewish people, and that's a symbol, in a sense, of the power of truth, the power of courage, the power of honesty to discover truth and to pursue truth. And perhaps because I mentioned Einstein initially, I would say two things. One is when when Einstein was asked once how come it came to be or to pass that he discovered the theory of relativity, he said, "Sometimes I wonder and I ask myself, how come I discovered the theory of relativity?" He said, "I think it's because most people wonder about space and time, energy and mass when they're children, and by the time they become adults, they've figured it out." And he said humbly, because my intellectual development was retarded, I continued to wonder about these things as an adult, implying that Einstein's genius was not just intellectual. Einstein's genius came from his open-mindedness, from his courage. You know that during the second half of his illustrious scientific career, as I mentioned many times, he's considered one of the two greatest geniuses the world has ever known, him and Isaac Newton. And so when he reflected and he said, "Sometimes I wonder how come it came to pass that I developed the theory of relativity." And he said, as I said, it's because of the open-mindedness of a child. He was continuing to look at the world as a child. He wasn't taking things for granted. He also had a quote saying, common sense is only that which is common to the senses. In other words, the assumption, for example, of Newtonian mechanics that there was absolute time, an imaginary clock ticking everywhere in the same rate, that was a given. When Einstein came along, that was a given. And Einstein's genius had to do with his open-mindedness and his imagination and his willingness to question and challenge some of the norms and some of the basic assumptions of the old Newtonian mechanical thought. And by the way, one of the reasons that this God's physics paradigm, new paradigm, and the book that I wrote for the general public, published by iUniverse.com, one of the name of this theory, before I named it recently over the last few years as God's physics, the name of this theory is originally the computational unified field theory, and that's in great respect for Einstein's, again, very courageous and visionary, I would almost say, visionary conception and quest for what he called the unifying field theory, or the unified field theory, which could essentially unify and bridge the gap between relativity theory about the macroscopic universe and quantum mechanics about the microscopic world. And even on his deathbed, the saying goes that even on his deathbed he was still scribbling, trying to find that ultimate equation that could unify between the macroscopic universe and the microscopic universe, between relativity theory and quantum mechanics. He was ridiculed, by the way, or he was at least criticized for his 30 years of intensive quest, the second half of his illustrious career, looking for this unified field theory. Even though he wasn't able to complete it, I believe he had a vision which now turns out to be precisely right. So I called my theory initially the computational unified field theory, because I think it does fulfill exactly what Einstein was looking for. There's a previous book of mine called What If Einstein Was Right? And I admire Einstein's courage and foresight and vision and willingness to go and pursue what maybe not a lot of people would do, but pursue truth. So I would mention here also, before I draw the parallels to what's happening today in science, I would quote and explain briefly. I did this in previous presentations, but I think it's relevant for today's talk. You know that science evolves. Thomas Kuhn, the famous philosopher of science, is telling us that science evolves by leaps and bounds. He's saying at a certain time science has a paradigm, standard paradigm such as Newtonian mechanics, and it's good for a while. Then it, in a sense, has reached the limits of its usefulness, and it has to expand and, in a sense, give way to a newer paradigm, to a new paradigm which is much more expansive, which can explain various theoretical inconsistencies that seem to exist within the old paradigm, and that opens new vistas, promising vistas, and a much greater understanding of the physical reality. So that's what happened when Einstein came along. Newtonian mechanics was considered the standard paradigm, the appropriate paradigm for 19th century physics, and even before that. Then Einstein came along and said, okay, there are problems within Newtonian mechanics. There is a contradiction between Newtonian mechanics and Maxwellian theory. There is a major phenomenon that Newtonian mechanics cannot explain, which was the ether, a fine element, assumed hypothetical, purely hypothetical, assumed fine element called the ether, which was supposed to perfuse the whole universe, but yet it could not be detected. And Michelson-Morley experiment and others. And then Einstein's genius came into play, and his courage, his genuine and courageous search for truth, with the willingness to discard certain assumptions that were appropriate for the old paradigm, but then for the new paradigm they're too constrictive. So you have to open the door and find that the room is part of a house, and the house is part of a neighborhood and a state, etc. And that open-mindedness and courage to venture out of the acceptable norms and the acceptable standard assumptions into a new kind of thinking. That's the courage and the genius that Einstein's thoughts and courageous thinking has allowed science to evolve. So at this point, when science reaches the limit of the old paradigm and has to expand into a new paradigm, what happens is that the in this case Einstein identified at least one critical prediction that differentiated his new paradigm, relativity theory, for 20th century physics than the old paradigm, Newtonian mechanics prediction, that was about regarding the curvature of Mercury's perihelion pathway around the sun, which Einstein predicted would be double the value of what Newton predicted. And then when Eddington, again I'm mentioning him in this exciting talk today, celebrating Hanukkah for the Jewish people, and more broadly celebrating and talking about, focusing on the courage to discover truth, or God's physics new scientific paradigm for the 21st century, the courage to discover truth. So Eddington, alongside with Einstein, accomplished a tremendous thing, and it did necessitate courage. Eddington wanted to verify and validate whether in fact Einstein's critical prediction about Mercury's double-valued perihelion around the sun, whether that was in fact true and valid. And so he ventured with an expedition on the 1919 solar eclipse, and he was able to validate Einstein's prediction. And pretty much overnight, relativity theory, general relativity theory, became the acceptable and the accepted new paradigm for 20th century physics. And as I said, we stand now at an equivalent point. And I'm actually calling today again cosmologists, astronomers, experimental physicists, those bold and courageous scientists, true scientists, just as Eddington was, just as Einstein was, true scientists, true bold experimental physicists, astronomers, cosmologists, to venture out and test two of God's physics' new 21st century paradigm, scientific paradigm. I mentioned in previous presentations, and I mentioned it in the 50 to 60, now actually 60 plus articles, with the third special issue that's about to come out in press, and the two critical, so there are already two critical predictions that have been validated for this new God's physics paradigm. One has to do with the proton radius puzzle, which is something about the more spatially consistent measures of a more massive particle, such as the muon affected hydrogen proton relative to the electron, which is less massive, and its influence on the proton radius. So that proton radius puzzle, which cannot be explained, and it's now from 2010, cannot really be explained by quantum mechanics or relativity theory, but it does verify and validate one of the critical predictions, unique critical predictions of God's physics new paradigm, with the computational unified field theory new paradigm, which essentially says that because there exists a singular higher ordered universal computational principle, which we mentioned, that computes the whole universe as a series of frames, many trillions of frames per second, and because this universal computational / consciousness principle, UCP, computes simultaneously the entire physical universe, therefore the predictions of this God's physics new paradigm essentially have been verified both for the proton radius puzzle and also for another prediction which has to do with the non-continuous accelerated expansion rate of the universe, and that's also associated, and that's one of the things that I'm calling cosmologists and astronomers to validate, is due to a collective human consciousness focus, which happens whenever a large group of human beings, such as in the Jewish Rosh Hashanah, 2 days a New Year time interval, then there occurs a non-continuous accelerated expansion of the universe. So that's another prediction that has initially been verified about the non-continuous accelerated expansion of the universe. But again, I'm highlighting and calling now those bold astronomers, cosmologists, experimental physicists working in subatomic accelerators to try and verify now and validate and communicate with me directly for that matter and purpose, my personal email is drbentwich, drbentwich @gmail.com. It's published in all of the articles. But to communicate with me directly and collaborate and venture out and validate some further direct empirical validations of this new scientific paradigm for the 21st century. And I think that perhaps what we want to speak about, when I want to speak about now, is to highlight again some of the exciting discoveries of this new God's physics paradigm. It's the first time in science that the four basic physical features of space, time, energy, and mass have been unified in one formula, the universal computational formula. That's taking science one significant step forward beyond Einstein's unification of space, time, energy, and mass, and the curvature of space-time by massive objects. But Einstein was not yet able. He did work on it, and I believe he was very close to discovering this universal computational formula, which completely unifies between space, time, energy, and mass. So that's a major accomplishment of this new God's physics paradigm. Another eye-opening discovery is the fact that there is, for the first time in physics, a moral principle entering into physics, and the notion that this universal computational principle or consciousness principle possesses a bank, a reservoir of all past, present, and multiple possible futures, frames, universal frames, or realities of the world, future multiple realities of the world, depending on the moral choice of every human being. I give the metaphor of a trampoline in which there is a metal bar connecting 2 points in the trampoline, and imagine that one point is pushing the other point. That would be a metaphoric for, God forbid, one individual human being having a choice and inflicting some sort of discomfort or suffering on another human being. And if you push the metal bar, the elastic membrane of the trampoline will push it back. So in other words, that's a metaphor for the dynamic equilibrium moral principle, which essentially says that this singular higher ordered universal computational or consciousness principle does possess a moral principle that balances and in a sense teaches humanity at large and human beings, every individual human being specifically or individually, that we're all part of the same membrane, we're all part of the same singular higher ordered universal computational / consciousness principle, and therefore that whenever any human being inflicts pain or suffering on another human being, the universal computational principle or consciousness principle would actually compute and present and position that human being, individual that inflicted pain, in a similar equivalent situation where they would have to experience some discomfort, not as a punishment, but as a means for us to realize that we're one, we're really part of the same singular higher ordered universal consciousness principle or reality. And so we understand that for the first time in physics, a moral principle becomes a major cornerstone of our understanding of how the universe evolves. Another thing that we spoke about and is quite amazing is that this new God's physics paradigm essentially teaches us